So I'm John Maddox, and I'm going to be giving a presentation today on Kessler syndrome. So Kessler syndrome is a phenomena coined in the 70s by a scientist named Donald Kessler. So it's essentially this thing that happens, could theoretically happen, when you get so many satellites in orbit that they start running into each other and destroying themselves. So when you have two things collide in orbit, they're moving so fast that when they smash together, they essentially create these clouds of debris that will spread out and go on to hit other satellites and things. So we've had a couple of satellite collisions, but Kessler syndrome is this idea that you get enough satellites up there that you have one collision that sparks another and another and another, and you get this cascade of collisions that eventually leads to this shell of debris in orbit that will destroy anything that you're launching, so you can no longer launch things into space. So clearly, Kessler syndrome is a big problem for the space industry. We have this, we have to decide whether we want to continue launching satellites and making progress and making profits, or focus on the safety and usability of the orbits around Earth. So we need to kind of find a balance between how many satellites are enough to get the stuff done we want to get done, and how many is too many that we risk a lot of collisions and Kessler syndrome. So you can see this graph over here is showing the amount of satellites in orbit from 2005 to 2023. You can see that big orange block there is Starlink, so we'll talk about that in a second, but it is trending up very rapidly. So we are every year getting to more and more risk of Kessler syndrome as we launch more stuff to orbit. So these trends are unsustainable as they are now. They'll probably level off at some point, but the question is, will they level off before or after we start having that collisions cascade happening? So Starlink is a project by SpaceX. It's thought up by Elon Musk. He wants to get internet for everybody around the globe. So it would be high-speed, reliable internet, uplink and downlink, so you could stream Netflix, you could play games on it, talk to anyone on the globe, even in North or South Pole, most remote regions of the planet. So there's great potential for progress there to be had, but to make Starlink work, we're going to need thousands of satellites in orbit forming this network around the globe so that they can all talk to each other and to ground stations. So each satellite that goes up, that's an increased chance that we're going to have two of those satellites collide and start creating more debris, or that those satellites are going to collide with another satellite and create more debris. So each satellite that goes up is another person connected, but it's also another satellite in danger of being hit. So you can see back on this slide here, there's been a major uptick in the amount of Starlink satellites going up, and that's only going to increase going forward until their shell is complete. So that trend there is pretty well extrapolatable into the future. So Project Kuiper is essentially the exact same thing as Starlink, except this time it's by Amazon and Jeff Bezos. So they're going to make a shell around the Earth of satellites, just like Starlink. You can kind of see a representation of that shell there. Again, you're going to have all of these satellites up there in addition to the Starlink satellites. So imagine all of those satellites you saw earlier plus another set of those in orbit, and you're starting to get a lot of chances that two of these things are going to run into each other and start causing problems. So these two aren't the only two plans for satellite networks like this. They're actually referred to as constellations of satellites, just like constellations in the sky, just because there are so many of them. But there are plans in other countries and companies like the ESA to make smaller but still significant satellite constellations to provide high-speed internet around the globe. So you can imagine 3, 4, 5 times that number of satellites in space. So another problem we're running into with Kessler syndrome is anti-satellite tests. So in 2021, Russia launched an anti-satellite missile that destroyed one of their satellites, and it created hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris in orbit that slowly spread around and just increased the debris field in size. That debris field eventually got big enough that it started to endanger the International Space Station, and it had to take evasive maneuvers right after the test to make sure it didn't get holes punched in it. So each of those hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris have the chance to strike another satellite and create hundreds of thousands more. So you can kind of see how this could propagate so rapidly into that collision cascade. So anti-satellite tests like this, not just performed by Russia, the US has done a couple, so has China, but the treaties you got in space to minimize space debris means most countries have stopped doing them, but some countries like Russia, and I think North Korea is planning a couple of anti-satellite tests, they're still causing problems for debris in orbit. So what can we do to make sure that we don't run into Kessler syndrome in the future, that we can keep launching stuff into space unopposed? So one idea is debris removal. So there are a lot of ideas out there to get rid of debris from space. This idea here by the ESA, the European Space Agency, is to essentially just take a big net up to space and grab a satellite and tow it back down into the atmosphere so that it can't run into anything. There are other ideas where you would take a satellite that's just covered in really strong electromagnets, and you'd shoot it up into a debris field, turn it on, and attract a bunch of that debris, and then you'd deorbit it, where you could process that debris on the ground and make sure it doesn't stay up there. Another idea would be ground-based lasers, so you could take small pieces of debris and vaporize them up there, so they just turn into gas, they're not a problem anymore. Or in larger pieces of debris, you could actually vaporize a certain side of that debris so that it essentially works like a rocket. The gas escaping out one side pushes it, and it'll deorbit itself through that laser action. So those are some ideas for debris removal. They're all really expensive, but it's better than not being able to launch anything. So there are a lot of people looking into that. Another idea is detailed orbital tracking. So keeping track of every single object that is in orbit at the moment. So we already do that pretty well. We can track objects larger than 3 centimeters diameter if they're in orbit with radar. Anything smaller than that we can't really track. We know it's up there because we can track kind of the debris cloud, but we can't track individual pieces. So that's how we knew how to move the ISS. Because we could see all those debris pieces coming towards it. So tracking debris pieces like that is really important, but also tracking the orbits of satellites, so that if you see, setting up like an automated system where if you've got a satellite or 2 satellites on a collision course, you can send an order to one of them to move so you avoid that collision. Low altitude, high drag orbits are also another great thing. So Starlink and Project Kuiper are occupying pretty high altitude, low altitude, high drag orbits, so that after 5-10 years, they run into so much drag that they'll actually just kind of spiral back down to the planet, so that they don't stay up there forever. And the satellites are only designed to last that long, so that's at the end of their operational lifespan anyway. Minimizing destructive tests like anti-satellite tests, and increasing fines for orbital littering. DirecTV just left a satellite parked up in geostationary orbit. They were supposed to deorbit it, but they left it up there for too long and it ran out of fuel, and they got a very small fine in comparison to the money that they made for leaving it up there. So they were essentially just rewarded for creating a bunch of space junk. So planning for the future, we want to implement all of those strategies to make sure that we don't have a collision cascade, we don't have stuff getting left in orbit, stuff running into satellites to make more debris. We want to put pressure on space organizations to make sure they minimize debris and take these things into consideration. We want to develop more processes and technologies to clean up space junk and avoid collisions. And we want to remove debris from orbit wherever possible. So that's all I've got. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, so I know like the advancements in space like ships, like something like Starship. Do you think they could? Do you think if you take Starship and then you take a more advanced satellite, that you could place it in something like a Lagrange point or something, and then create like another area of satellites so you could keep putting up as many satellites, but just out of the way. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah. So once you get the Kessler syndrome thing in effect, you can't launch anything anymore. But like to avoid that, instead of putting a bunch of satellites really close to the Earth, maybe put a few or even more further away so that you don't have that shell building up, right? That can work if you need stuff like telescopes or lower speed internet, but because they're so far away, you'll get a lot more ping that way, so a lot more communications lag. So that's why stuff like Starlink and Project Kuiper are in such low orbits, because the closer they are to the surface, the lower that lag between communication is. So it can work for some things, but not others. So it's kind of a balancing act. Like we may want to limit it to 1 or 2 communication satellite constellations that low, so we don't have 6 up there fighting for space.
So how, I guess in situations like with the DirecTV satellite and stuff like that, how is airspace in that way currently managed? Is it like the U.S. government, with them being a U.S.-based company, they're responsible for enforcing satellite policies with that company, or how's that?
So there's, I forget the name of the organization, but there's a global space organization kind of board that comes together, signs treaties, makes rules. You have to have your country sign that treaty to have it be effective. So we've made these treaties. China doesn't follow a lot of them. North Korea hardly follows any. So those countries that haven't signed the treaty, they aren't subject to the rules of them, so they really don't have to follow those rules. But with like DirecTV, they got a fine. That's managed by the U.S. government, I think. I think the FCC actually is the one that gave them the fine for that, because the FCC for some reason is managing that orbit. That satellite was in geostationary orbit, so it hovered in the same place above the Earth constantly, whereas like Starlink and stuff, they make loops around more regularly. But it's kind of all haphazardly managed. There's no real like one definitive thing.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I can do another one.
Yeah.
Do you think like that governing body for the space, do you think they could tell people like SpaceX, Amazon, whoever runs like OneWeb, because I know that's another one, do you think that they could make them combine, like, be like, you guys all have to use these satellite, like, you just share the satellites instead of having your own and jumping up the atmosphere more?
Yeah, so like if an organization was like, we can only have this amount of constellations in orbit, somebody's got to go, they could essentially enforce that through the FAA, who provides launch licenses. So they could be like, hey, launch providers, if satellites for this constellation are going up, they actually don't launch your rocket, don't send them up to orbit, only launch these approved ones. And without a launch license, you can't launch anything, so they could kind of enforce it that way. Anybody else?